Long before From Software hit it big with Demon's Souls back in 2009, there was another series they milked the life out of called Kingsfield. The series got a few spin-offs, like Eternal Ring and, more importantly, Shadow Tower, but just in case people don't know about it, I'll give a brief rundown of the main Kingsfield series. It was shit. Okay, joking aside, they weren't that bad, they were just quite niche games that you either really loved or really hated, and would only appeal to the type of person who would look at this and thinks to themselves, yeah, I want to do this for 20 hours. And herein lies the problem, as it turns out I am one of those people. Because in all honesty, I really fucking like the idea of Kingsfield, atmospheric first-person dungeon crawling with lots of little nooks and crannies to explore. So I'm quite sad that I don't like Kingsfield that much because I really want to. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel, a light that was rather ironically a shadow. Tower. A game that took all I liked about Kingsfield, and presented it in such a way that I didn't mind putting up with the awkward controls and actually really liked it. And just my luck, it had a sequel. A sequel that was so obscure that the only evidence of its existence on YouTube is about 3 different Let's Plays all made 5 years ago. And that was just an injustice I would not stand for, leading us to the point where we are at now, where I wasted about a minute of your time talking about how I found a game rather than actually talking about it. So I guess I better start now. In the same vein as Kingsfield, it's your typical fantasy RPG dungeon crawler, as long as you ignore the part where your starting weapon is an M1911. Because of course, this being a video game of all the pistols in the world to be the starting gun, it would be the M1911. So yes, Shadow Tower Abyss takes place in the modern day, but at the same time you explore a tower that is filled with medieval fantasy-esque weapons and monsters. It's quite a strange contrast when you're exploring these ancient caverns, decked out in medieval chainmail and fighting off enemies with swords and axes, and then 5 hours later you're shooting harpies with an M16. A contrast that will forever be hilariously brilliant to me, and is just one of the many reasons why I love this game. Although, to be honest, I wasn't 100% convinced of this modern aspect to begin with. I mean, Kingsfield and Shadow Tower had very firm roots in traditional fantasy, so playing this game and having the first piece of armour I stumble across be a freaking bucket hat was a bit of a shock. But any first-person dungeon crawler that lets me use a grenade launcher cannot be bad, that's all I'm gonna say. Gameplay is your standard dungeon crawling affair. You wander through a bunch of identical looking caverns, fight some monsters, level up, pick up another bucket hat, spend 5 minutes comparing that bucket hat with the one you already have equipped, you know, the usual. Actually, come to think of it, something did sound a bit unusual, the leveling up part. See, something unique about Shadow Tower is that there are no levels to up. Your character just naturally gets more stronger the more they use their abilities, and also depending on what you have equipped. Now, what any of these stats actually mean, well, that's anyone's guess. Some things like vitality and strength seem pretty obvious, but honestly, if anyone can tell me the difference between concentration, mentality and mind, I would really appreciate it. And sure, I could just look up a guide, except you can't, because there are none. Yes, we really have delved that deeply into the unknown and obscure that not even game FAQs can provide us a walkthrough. I mean, in game FAQ's defense, this is a sequel to an already obscure RPG that was only released in Japan. Now, the more eagle-eyed among you might have noticed, that's not Japanese, and that's because thankfully an English fan translation does exist. You can tell by the way I'm using it. Which is probably actually a good thing, considering how dodgy some of From Software's earlier translations were. But then again, the person who made this one can't even spell ring right, so what do I know? And speaking of awkward segues, what? The combat in this game is really cool, which is also a pretty funny way of saying awkward and simple, come to think of it. The main focus of the game is the exploration, and it does a really good job of it, but of course you can't just let the player wander through all these corridors and have nothing to fight. So while the combat system isn't really the best, it's good enough for what it needs to do. That isn't to say the game is content with having a mediocre battle system though. and actually does quite a few cool things to step it up a notch. You have 4 different attacks and all the enemies have different body parts that can be severed providing you hit them right. This opens up quite a few different tactics, like chopping off the arm of a large enemy wielding a massive club so he won't be able to deal as much damage, or shooting the wings off a harpy so it has to fight you on the ground. Add to these 4 attacks the surprisingly varied selection of guns and bows you can use to pick off enemies from afar, and the magic, which, well, okay, the magic is kinda lame if I'm being honest, and you have a pretty fun combat system, albeit one that makes all the bosses really easy when you can just stand on the other side of the arena and shoot them. And yeah, sure, a lot of the time it does devolve into you just circling around the enemy and hitting them from behind, but if you want to be that pedantic about it, you could literally say the exact same thing about Dark Souls, and that's not really fair now, is it? Not to mention, the amount of variety is insane. There's 68 different monsters to fight and over 500 different weapons. I mean, you end up selling most of them, but... And speaking of selling, even that has an added layer of depth. The currency in Shadow Tower is the unfortunately named coons. Now, coons are in pretty small supply, you only stumbling across maybe 1 or 2 of them at a time. Not to mention, you don't get many coons for selling old equipment, usually around 2 apiece. But what you could do instead of trading it in for a few measly coons is use it to fully replenish your health and magic. And then of course you have to repair your gear you're actually using, which you don't do with coons, but you instead do in exchange of health. Just, you know, good luck actually reading how much. So the game makes you play a sort of cool balancing act as you decide what to sell so you can buy new gear, what to use to replenish your health, and then deciding what to repair with the health you just gained. It's a neat little system that I don't think I've seen anywhere else that makes the game just a little bit more unique. The game is pretty linear as far as RPGs go, with you progressing up the titular Shadow Tower from its abyss, in order to find a spear that can grant the wishes of anyone who uses it. And then you eventually get the spear, and then it breaks, and then the game just sort of makes you continue climbing the tower because I'm not really sure, to be honest. Needless to say, it is quite difficult to get lost in a game where the only way you need to go is up. But From Software realised this, and so made each area quite complex and then didn't give you a map for any of it, which was nice of them. So while the game is linear, the places you actually explore are not, and resulted in me legitimately having to draw out a map in real life, and you know what, I had an absolute blast while doing it. And also looks like something a 9-year-old would draw. And the designs. Oh my god, the designs. From Software has always had some of the best designers in the industry, and it really shows here. The enemies and environments are really detailed, even if, you know, you can't actually see much. And the weapons and armor all look fucking sick. Like, honestly, some of my favourite weapon designs of all time can be found in this game. And this good design is something you can find in all From Software games, even the ones I'm not a massive fan of. It really helps bring a sense of progression, and reaching the end of the game really makes you feel like you've accomplished something as you get access to some of the coolest items in the game and magic spells that look really, really cool. Well, it's about that time of the video where I realise all I've done so far is list positives, and thus must completely shit on the game for a minute or two to balance things out before saying the game is my favourite PS2 game ever made. Because for as much as I do really, really like this game, like you guys should really actually play it, there are quite a few flaws that I feel like I do need to bring up. For starters, I feel like they couldn't have made the turning speed any slower if they had tried. Except they did, because when you walk on the cobwebs it gets even slower, which is fun. And a lot of the bosses are kind of underwhelming too, although maybe that's my fault for standing on the other side of the room and just shooting them. And perhaps most importantly, the length of the game absolutely takes the piss. I mean, you would expect an RPG to be long. The original Kingsfield in 1997 lasted 12 hours. The game before this, Kingsfield 4, lasted 20. Shadow Tower Abyss is 8. Not 80, just 8. Which is a bit disappointing. I finally found a game in the series I fucking love, and it's somehow the shortest out of all of them. But that isn't to say the game feels like it ends out of nowhere. By the end of the game, it does feel like the end of the game. But I would be lying if I said I didn't want it to last a few more hours. I mean, there is New Game Plus if that's your kind of thing, but I mean, come on. 8 hours, seriously? In the end, Shadow Tower Abyss, rather unexpectedly, ended up being one of my favourite PS2 games I've ever played. It's deeply atmospheric and draws you into its world. It's fun to explore, ripe with treasure and secrets to discover, and I would absolutely recommend that if you thought this game even slightly appeals to you, that you should give this criminally underrated gem a chance. Dare I even say it, it might be better than Dark Souls? I mean, probably not, but you know, still pretty good. To be honest, it's made me want to give Kingsfield a second chance. I mean, if I like this game, then why not Kingsfield, seeing how similar they are? Yeah, okay, maybe not.